Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us during today's presentation and Q&A on Rethinking Meaningful Student Assessment with Dr. Maria Araceli Ruiz-Primo, who we know as Aita, and Sara Dozier, organized by the Stanford Graduate School of Education. My name is Manaf Mansour, and I'm the Associate Director of Alumni Relations and Community Engagement at the Graduate School of Education at Stanford University, and will moderate today's Q&A. And with that, I'll turn it over to Aita and first off to Sara. Thank you both for joining us today.
Hi, thank you so much, Manaf, for that lovely introduction. We're going to talk about some best practices and also what the research tells us about how to engage in assessment. But because we only have a short time together, we're going to be focused on students from kindergarten through 12th grade, although the principles we're going to discuss are applicable to higher ed as well. And our presentation is going to focus on formative assessment. That isn't to say that summative and accountability assessment aren't important, but for the purpose of this talk, we're going to stay focused on assessment that teachers do in the classroom, assessment for learning rather than assessment of learning. Another thing to remember is that we're in these unprecedented times and the world of online teaching and learning is extremely complex. So as we go through our comments and your questions, we're going to discuss the opportunities that online learning affords us, and also we'll discuss some of the challenges that come up and some of the ways to approach those challenges. Finally, I want to say that as an education community, folks are focused more and more on equity in both instruction and assessment, which is wonderful. So during our comments today, we're going to be addressing how to make formative assessment more equitable for students, and we're happy to address questions regarding assessment equity in the Q&A session. So as a way of introduction, I am going to start by sharing 4 big ideas about formative assessment, and then Dr. Ruiz-Primo is going to take us on a deeper dive. So first big idea is that assessment and grading are actually 2 different and distinct processes. Assessment is how we figure out how students are understanding the material that we hope they learn, and grading is how we assign a number or a letter to that work. And so although we often conflate them in our heads, they are in fact quite different. Of course, grading is deeply embedded in all of our school structures, and we definitely need to discuss it. But I would argue that if you focus on assessment and you think very carefully about how your students are understanding the material, you'll actually do a better job of assigning a meaningful grade to your students. And so today, rather than talking about the best way to assign grades, we're going to focus on the best way to assess student learning and understanding. The second big idea I want to put forth is that what a student understands in their mind and what they say aloud or what they write down on a piece of paper are distinct. Our students' minds are like a black box. As teachers, we give them opportunities to share their thinking so we can make inferences about how they're understanding the ideas that we're hoping that they are learning, but what they write and how they understand are not the same thing. Third big idea I'd like to share is that assessment is a process, not a piece of paper or a moment in time. So to engage in this process, the first thing you need to do is to figure out what it is that you want students to learn. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this in my 4th big idea in a moment. So step 1, set goal. Second step is to elicit student ideas and collect evidence about their understanding. So Dr. Ruiz-Primo, after I finish my remarks, is going to share some more ideas about different ways to collect evidence of student understanding. So once you have this evidence of how students are thinking, you need to interpret it and you need to make inferences about how they're learning, right? And then you and the students together are going to respond to that evidence. And you're going to do that by reflecting, by providing feedback, and by adjusting your instruction to make sure students are moving sort of in the direction that you want them to toward that goal that you set. You return to your original goal of what you wanted students to learn in the first place, and decide if that goal has been met or whether it needs to be modified as you go forward in your instructional cycle. So assessment is a process, not a task. And so when you hear Dr. Ruiz-Primo and I talking about assessment throughout this hour, it's important to hold that in your mind. So 4th big idea before I hand it over. My 4th big idea is to choose thoughtfully what you assess. Setting goals for student understanding is key to successful assessment. And we know that in order for assessments to be equitable, we need to consider students' interests and values when we design our learning and assessment tasks. And there's a lot of ways to do this. I'm happy to talk more about in the Q&A about how you can find out what's interesting and important to students, relevant to the content that you're hoping that they learn. So after you figure out what your students care about, then you need to think hard about what's really important to you as the teacher. So you can think sort of in 10 years, if I ran into that student on the street and they said, oh my gosh, Ms. D, in your class, I learned X, Y, and Z. What is it that you want them to say? Like, what are the most important ideas? And thinking about what was important to them and what's important to you, where is that overlap? And as you think about designing an assessment opportunity, you want to think about the overlap of those two circles. And then you can consider the standards or other documents guiding the content that your sort of leadership expects you to teach your students. Now, hopefully you'll find a nice overlap between your students' interests and your hopes and dreams and what you're expected to teach. But remember, you have to consider that you can only listen and observe a tiny fraction of all the things that are important. And so this is where you really figure out that one critical thing you want students to take away and focus on that in your assessment. So just to recap, my big ideas are what a student says and what a student thinks are not necessarily the same thing. Assessment is distinct from grading. Assessment is a process, not a task. And be thoughtful about what it is that you choose to assess. And I just want to note that the dot is not drawn to scale. What you can elicit and observe is actually quite small. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my slides and turn it over to Dr. Ruiz-Primo.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you everybody for being with us today. I want to focus on two of the facets of formative assessment that Sarah mentioned before, which is what the students should be learning and how can we elicit and gathering information. There is a lot to say about all of this. So I hope that by the end, as Sarah mentioned, it is very clear to you that what matters is that formative assessment is not a lot of tests that are administered to the students while we are implementing a unit. Before I move to that, I would like to share something that is very important for those of us who study formative assessment in classrooms, and that is the idea of different levels of formality. So we think about informal and formal formative assessment as a continuum. When I am thinking about informal formative assessment, is actually focusing on the idea that I can take any opportunity that is provided on everyday basis, any instructional activity, as an opportunity to gather information from students. This can happen, in a whole class or small group or one-to-one. This is what some people has referred to as on-the-fly assessment. It's unplanned and you just take the opportunity. Unfortunately, I think that most of you think about formative assessment as embedded assessments, tests that you just administer before the summative assessment, before the end of the unit or end of the year. Definitely, when we are talking about formal formative assessment, we are thinking about something that is planned very carefully, that we actually have a very formal task to gather that information. But another critical characteristic is the idea that it involves collecting information from all the students in the classroom. With that, keep this idea of informal formative assessment as critical, because I will come back to it over and over. So let me now focus on what the students should learn. And this seems sometimes like a very easy question. If I ask the teachers what students should learn, potentially they can focus on the first page of a unit of a chapter. And it seems to me, based on working with teachers who have participated in my projects, that sometimes when I ask questions such as these ones, why is this important for students to learn? Or why this activity comes before this other one? Or how does this activity contribute to the learning goal? If we as teachers cannot respond to these questions, then there is something that is telling us that we are not understanding deeply what students should be learning. So what we have done in some of my research projects is to, in different school districts, have teachers work in small groups, 2 or 3, and then ask them to review some of the lessons that they have to teach. They go lesson by lesson, trying to understand what is the main focus of the lesson, what is the type of knowledge that students need to do, how they arrive to that. Then they go to lesson 2, do the same thing, and come back to lesson 1 and try to reflect on what from lesson 1 is what is critical for students to learn on lesson 2, and then go to lesson 3 and try to understand, what from lesson 1 and lesson 2 is important for lesson 3. We have learned that by doing that, what happen is that teachers start having a clear understanding how students development of the learning comes from lesson to lesson, and they start seeing what is critical and what is not. And that is really fundamental in order to have clarity about what Sara says. Set a learning goal and have clarity, and not little learning objectives, but something that reflects more a mental model of how students should approach the learning. So here I am sharing a learning trajectory that has been the result of a similar process to the one that I am talking about. And this is a unit that focuses on relative density, and it has 12 investigations or lessons. And through the process that I mentioned, we were able to identify all the different levels of understanding that the students will be acquiring as they go through the different investigations. By doing that, we were able to identify where we really wanted to know where all the students were at certain points, at certain critical junctures. So we decided that was after the lesson 4, the 7, and the 10th. Keep this learning trajectory also in mind, because I will come back to it. Let me now move to eliciting evidence. Where can I get evidence about the students' understanding? If I come back to the informal and formal continuum, everything from the formative assessment perspective that the students say, do, write, their body language, their faces are sources of information. And some of these ways we just do it, in a very natural manner. But for us, most of the time, gathering evidence implies something that is documentary, something that I have to report from students. But actually, from the formative assessment perspective, is much more than that. So coming back to the informal and formal activities and eliciting information, I am coming back to the informal and formal of things that I know we all do in our classrooms when we are in real classrooms, but there are also other possibilities when we are doing online. I have already experienced that. We all listen to students, we all observe, we all question or ask students to ask those questions. And all of that is far more productive if we have clarity on the goal that we are trying to focus on. I know that the research also has proved that when teachers have this clarity on the goals, the observation, the listening is far more focused than if you don't have it. But we know that embedded assessment is what, unfortunately, everybody talks about formative assessment using tests and quizzes. However, as I mentioned before, there is also the possibility of gathering information at the whole classroom setting with any product that the students can be providing. And this and much more than you are collecting from the students on the everyday basis. Handouts, entrance tickets, exit tickets, and all of those are really very good sources of information as long as they are rich activities from which you can learn about the students' understanding. Before I leave this, I would like to share the idea that for all of us who are involved in research on formative assessment, something that actually matters is the classroom dialogue, the classroom talk. Why? Because talk is the most prevalent activity in any classroom, and therefore becomes a very, very powerful tool for you to improve student engagement and to know where students are and help them to move forward. There are many research, including some that we have done in my lab, that shows that better dialogue leads definitely to higher students' performance. So I mentioned before, rich activities, and rich, good instructional activities are rich, good assessments. There are two different sides of the same coin. But what are those? How can I recognize a good bridge assessment activity? It is one that allow me to make explicit students' thinking, where I can recognize what are different levels of students' understanding. It's an activity that I know how it contributes to achievement of the learning goal. It is one in which I know the student is using the learning. It's one that I know that I am pushing the student to think further. They struggle, but they struggle in a productive way that helps them to improve their understanding. One idea that I think is important for you to capture is that what we have learned observing many teachers in different classrooms is that when you have rich instructional activities, you as a teacher try to anticipate the students' responses. You figure out what are all the possible correct and incorrect ways in which students can approach the task. And with that, you are identifying the strengths and weaknesses. If you anticipate the students' responses, then you can anticipate the feedback and you can provide the students more helpful, focused feedback that they can use. So moving to that, let me share with you a very simple rich task. It's an open-ended question that asks why things sink or float. And this is the same learning trajectory. Notice that I didn't use learning progression of what I presented before. So these are the same lessons and these are the different levels. And I will share with you the responses of one student at different times during the implementation of the unit. If you can read this, you will see how the student's response actually reflects a different level of understanding, a more sophisticated way to explain why things sink or float. On the other hand, I have this other student in another classroom, which never could overcome the idea that weight was what actually matters for things sinking or floating. So as you can see, there are many different rich activities that are simple, and I'm not saying that you have to read all the students' responses. I don't have the time, but there are many different strategies that you can use to help students to share what they are understanding without you having a lot of things to focus on. To finish, I would like to focus on some tips. Some of them are really based on the research that we have conducted in my lab. I will talk only about those that I think I didn't talk in the previous slides. One is sharing the learning goal. And by that, I am not meaning that you write the learning goal at the top of the board or on the side or any part of the wall of the classroom. The best teachers that we have observed are teachers that continuously are telling the students why it is important what they are doing. So if you provide a handout and you tell the students, this is important because what I am expecting from you from doing this is, it really, really helps the students to know why am I doing what I am doing. So keep that in mind. The other one is engaging students. Again, I cannot tell you enough that classroom talk is a good way to do it. For this, I want to tell you something that is very important. After all the observations, we have learned that teachers tend to engage pretty much the same students over and over. So it is actually a sampling issue. You are sampling from the same students and you are not focusing on all the students that you have in your classroom. Engaging everybody is a good practice. It doesn't matter if the student is over there and not raising their hand, you have the possibility to ask always a question. Another thing that I would like to focus, which is the result of another project, is the idea of closing the discussion, the takeaway. Just like Sara did a few minutes ago, these are the 4 ideas that I wanted you to keep in mind. That is kind of closing the way he was discussing her slides. And we found out that those teachers who tend to have this closure of the discussion, their students perform better on regular tests. Finally, we don't have any time to talk really about feedback, but I can tell you one thing. If you provide feedback, which doesn't have to be one-to-one, there are many different types of feedback. If you don't provide the opportunity for students to respond to your feedback, it won't be as beneficial. And I guess that's it for me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Aita. And thank you all for submitting all of your questions here. We're going to go ahead and get started. And I'm going to start with a question directed to you, Aita. This is from Magda Chia. Can you shed light on the distinction between formal embedded formative assessment and interim diagnostic assessments? This is becoming increasingly important as schools plan to reopen in the fall after COVID-19.
At the classroom level, something that I don't agree very much about the interim assessments is the fact that they are actually not coming from students. These are assessments that are imposed at the school district level. They are external assessment. And what I have found from research is that teachers do not necessarily understand really what are the focus, the type of questions that the students are getting, and what to do with the information. There is a very good research reported by CIPRI some years ago, tracking teachers that were using these interim assessments, and it was very clear that they could not actually use the information the way it was expected. Part of it because they really did not understand the questions that the students were being asked, and therefore all the time they were saying, I know where my students are not doing well, but I really don't know how to involve them. So what they found is that teachers were actually using the information mainly to, in the best of the cases, regrouping students, and in the worst of the cases, reteaching the topics. So that is not really a good way of using. This is the idea of formative assessment, that it is imposed, and if I don't understand really what I am trying to gather from this evidence, then I don't think that is as productive when I am focusing just in formative assessment.
Fantastic. I'm going to move on to another question. This comes from Jane Kwan. With distance learning, I assessed student understanding based off of written work and videos that they submitted. These were all individual responses. Unfortunately, I only see the end product of their work and not the process. It's 2 questions. The first one is, how can teachers gain insight into the process and not just the product of student understanding in a remote setting? And the second question, you noted the whole class dialogue as part of assessment. You also mentioned that teachers tend to focus on the same particular student during whole class discussions. Can you clarify the duality?
So the process and the product. So I would say that then there is something about the way the assignment was designed that it does not allow the person to know what was the process that was followed by the student. If you only ask for a response and do not design the task, either with the steps, either with embedded questions that the student can respond, then of course you won't know what is the process that the student went through. If there is only a response, then yes, you don't know. And again, I want to emphasize the anticipation. The best teachers that we observe in all my projects, they all practice anticipation. They always have all these different possibilities in the responses that the students can provide to a particular prompt. What I observed in one of my best teachers ever was that based on this anticipation, she could design the same instructional activity for me, an assessment task, that actually, with some modification, was above the level that she was hoping the students would be and below the level. So as she came to the classroom and was walking around, and she knew immediately, it was amazing to me to see that she could immediately know where students were with a quick look, because she had all these possibilities in their mind. So immediately she said, oh, I think that what you are missing, blah, 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 blah. And either she could do 2 things: switch for a task that was at the lower level, but targeting what the students needed to actually respond. And another thing that she did very frequently was to have always stickies. So in a very efficient way, she was walking around, writing on stickies and putting the stickies on the students' desks. I have never seen someone giving at the individual level feedback at more than 90% of their students in a task that lasts 5 or 6 minutes. She was amazing. And the interviews, all of them revealed that she had anticipated the students' responses. So she knew exactly when she was observing certain type of response, she knew what to focus on, she noticed what she needed to notice, and then provide the feedback. So I think that in that sense, potentially is a revelation of not using a rich instructional activity for gathering information. That's what I would say is the main problem. And I forgot the second question because I didn't write it. Sorry.
That's okay. The second question was, in the presentation, you noted the whole class dialogue is part of assessment, and you also mentioned that teachers tend to focus on that same particular student during whole class discussions.
Okay.
So if you can clarify the duality there.
Yes. So I need to explain the type of research that I have done in formative assessment. I have followed no one teacher, really many teachers on the everyday basis. I videotape on top of being in the classroom, not me directly, my students in my lab, the people who I collaborate with. So what we notice when you analyze the videos day after day is that teachers really honestly tend to focus on the same students when they need to move on. They focus on the one that you know they will respond, and they do it very easily, just saying, so okay, after 2 or 3 that did not respond what I wanted, I go to Sara, because I know that Sara will always respond correctly, and once she responds correctly, my inference is everybody understands, let's move on. That is one thing. The other thing that we observed, because we did another project with English language learners, is that teachers tend not to ask English language learners anything, because according to them, they cannot respond. It is embarrassing. There are multiple ways that they can tell you. And actually, I think that that is not having an equity practice, because I think we have observed teachers that they know that the students may not speak English very well, but they use different strategies. Let me give you an example. We have one teacher that was working with the states of matter. So what she did was to have students doing the different, enact the different state of matters with their hands. And another time they did it using blocks of good, and she could say to everybody in the class, I want you to represent with the blocks the gas, and then 1, 2, 3, everybody. And then the students who actually understood put the blocks in very different areas, representing how everything was disparity. She did it in so many different ways. She invented a song for students to sing. So there are ways that you can gather information, again, if you know what you are looking for. So I found through the analysis of many different videos that the sampling of a student's understanding in classroom discussions with the whole classroom, the sampling of the students is really very small. It's really very small. I think that teachers need to be far more conscious about, I will ask today these guys, tomorrow these other guys, tomorrow these other guys. If you do that, then you start having actually that sense of where everybody is. The best teachers that I have, they actually were very purposeful in thinking about all the students and how they match the students for a small group, and how they bring them, how she could engage them in the discussion. And unfortunately, I really didn't have time, because I wanted to actually share some of the practices that I observed with the best teachers. It is really amazing what you can do and how can you engage if you do it on purpose. So I'm not sure if I respond to your question. I just want to emphasize that sampling happens in the classroom and can be a very biased sampling.
Sara, did you want to add just a couple of tips or strategies to look at with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think in addition to everything that Aida said, it's important to remember that sort of all students have linguistic resources, and that when we're talking about equity of assessment, we're talking about equity of participation, not equity of voice. And so students who use their linguistic resources in other ways, and this sort of actually addresses Preetha's question as well, kids who are more comfortable using their linguistic resources in different ways we need to give them opportunities to do that. So, you know, some students maybe feel really put on the spot, and it may actually raise their affective filter to ask them a question in front of the class. But there are ways that you can still elicit information from that student. Like, for example, you could do the Post-it trick that I was talking about moments ago, where you write a question for a student and say like, hey, I'd really like you to share this idea. Make a lot more opportunities for small group talk that you can eavesdrop on. So just thinking about what are the ways in which we allow students to share their ideas using all of their linguistic resources is really important.
I have to ask the most in-demand question on our chat, which is from Craig Young. In a distance learning mode, where eliciting evidence from body language, facial expressions, etc., is much more difficult, do you have suggestions for gathering informal evidence of learning?
Craig, this is such an important question. And I think that one of the things that has become really clear, I think to many parents, I noticed this with the kids in my own house doing homeschool, and also watching my partner teach English online every day for the last quarter, is that we miss so much of what's happening with the kids when we're in an online environment. And so it necessarily makes it less efficient to do the kinds of informal assessment we're talking about. So I'm prefacing my answer by saying that there is no way that we can do what we do in the classroom with our students in terms of the relationships that we build and the ways that we ask them to share their ideas in an online environment. What I will say is that if you can use, now, okay, let me say one more caveat. Every district seems to be having different issues around online learning. In some districts, you can't ask students to unmute themselves. Some districts, you can't turn on their cameras. In some districts, kids are not allowed to be on without turning on their cameras. So all of those considerations are specific to classrooms and matter. Like, all that stuff really makes a difference. What I'll say is that in online learning, when I've seen teachers use breakout rooms to engage kids in discussions around stuff that matters. And I think this goes back to that. What's your goal? How are you choosing? I think that I have seen teachers glean tremendous amounts of evidence by listening to kids have really rich discussions in breakout rooms. Now, you're listening to this group, and in the real classroom, you're also listening to like the 3 other adjacent groups to see where it's going off the rails, and you really miss that in an online environment. But you still can gather a lot of the information about kids if you have the opportunity to listen to them have small group discussions. To a lesser degree, that happens if you can have them chat, right? Like, you know, sort of like chatting in the running comments. But I think that when I consider the affordances of online learning, the thing that's most apparent to me is that this is our opportunity to stop and think about what really matters. I mean, really matters to us and to kids, because when we throw items at kids and ask them questions that we treat more like as I'm just going to ask a lot and then see what sticks and what's good, we can kind of do that in the classroom, and we know it's not best practice, but we just can't get away with it online. It just doesn't work. So this is our opportunity to be really thoughtful about what it is we want to ask kids, what's important, and then finding really rich tasks that could be question prompts or written to get them to do that. Aida, do you want to add to that?
No, I think that you hit on the part that I wanted. What really matters, and that if you understand, you know, the process that I talked before during the slides is a process that allowed teachers to identify the most critical activities, that the ones that actually contribute to students' learning, but also, you know, if you can understand what is, let's say, superficial, because right now I don't have a better word, and what is really critical, then you focus on the critical, because you know that that is information that the students will need for the next lesson, and it will build to the next lesson. And that process is something that I feel, because of the everyday craziness, that we don't have the opportunity to reflect and think about. And teachers that have participated in the process that I mentioned, more than one have told me, I have been teaching this module for 8 years. And until I went through this process, I get it. Now I know why I'm doing what I am doing and what I don't want actually to do, because really doesn't help whatsoever. And what I need to provide the students, because I am just giving them the opportunity to do this, but I want them the opportunity to do that. I then talk a lot about a project in which we push for learning, how teachers were pushing students to transfer learning. For me, that is so critical for understanding. If we focus on an idea of understanding as how students use their knowledge in new contexts, if we all were pushing for that, then we will be focusing on better learning goals, and we will be providing opportunities to use that knowledge. Only when they use the knowledge, we really know that they are understanding and they are learning, I think. And I will stop.
Suzanne Koch writes, how do we ensure equity in online assessments, including access to materials for rich activities, or how to provide them tech, how to help parents in our current platform, in our current learning environment?
That is huge. It is really huge. And I don't know how you can solve the problem when you are in this little tiny room with 4 siblings, with only one cell phone, or forget about a computer. And it is only if the school district, or for that matters, at a higher level, we can help students to get the technology that they need at the minimum. So I don't have a good response for that, except that these times make the disparities, the inequities, much more evident. And what can I say? We are right now in a time in which we are learning about all the inequities that are so evident, and that we don't pay attention until something really huge happens. So I really don't have a good solution for it, but I do think that if at least there is maybe one cell phone, there are potentially possibilities. We're thinking about having a good connection system in your apartment or in your small house. There may be possibilities to figure out how students can make copies of their products and just send it to the teachers, and the teachers will be collecting, and if it is a good task, we should hope that they understand where students are and how can they help them for the next step in their learning, I guess. But Sara, I'm sure that she has a much better idea.
Nothing better, but I will say the risk of being pessimistic. I think that what this moment of online teaching and learning has done is shown us exactly how inequitable our system has always been. And so I think that one of the things to really consider is that we thought, maybe even I thought, when my students came into my classroom, it was my bubble, right? And I could protect them from the outside world, give them all the same experiences, and then I could be equitable, and then I could be fair. And I think that what I keep thinking about during this time is that it wasn't fair even then. And that when we talk about assessment, what we're really trying to do is figure out how kids are understanding, right? How do we probe them, right? How do we encourage them to share their ideas? And I think there are as many answers to that as there are students. I think one of the things that concerns folks in this world is how do we make grading fair versus how do we make assessing equitable? And I just want to encourage you to think first about, how can I get this kid to share their thinking? Do I need to, what are the regulations within my district? What am I allowed to do? Do I need to get on WhatsApp, right? Because kids who might not be willing to share and might not be willing to log on to Google Classroom may be willing to WhatsApp. I know a lot of teachers who are doing that and having kids take pictures of whatever it is that they're working on and text it to them, right? So there is no silver bullet, there is no fix, but your students. And that is like the hugest advantage in thinking about how to assess equitably. because you know them, you know who they are, and you have to use all of that information you have to figure out ways to reach them individually. Now, this is not an efficient process, right? And teachers can't be expected to take on the entire of coronavirus on their back. But if you want to be thinking about your students and how you could be moving the needle for them, I think it's considering, how am I asking different kids for evidence given the limitations that they might have in terms of access?
We are close to the end of our session, believe it or not. So I'm going to ask one last question before we all head off to the rest of our days and evenings. We are, as you've all have been living, as Aita and Sarah have been mentioning, we are living in a time of multiple pandemics and realizing new limitations, new inequities, new inequalities amongst various segments of our populations. And I want to know, with all of this kind of being unearthed, not to say that it never existed before, but more so the fact that we are now much more as a community, as a population, much more aware of these inequities. What is the silver lining for us as educators and teachers when we think about assessment? What can we look forward to? How can we seize this moment and this opportunity when we think about good, meaningful student assessment?
I could say, I think potentially two things. First, if you think too much about grading, you forget about learning. But if you're about to grade because you don't have another option, then think carefully what an A means for you in terms of the evidence that the students are understanding and learning, and share that with the students. So an A has a meaning. It's not an A for passing, it's not or a B or a C, but it really needs to have a meaning. Second, I think that I really, at the beginning at least, I thought that this could be such a good opportunity for teachers to step back and think on what it matters for students to learn. What is what they believe students need to have at the end of the school year for the next academic year, the next school year. And then forget about the other things that were not as relevant. Just focus on the most important thing. What matters to me in assessment is that we learn how to gather evidence about the students' understanding and how we can help them to move forward. And I know that sounds really, it's kind of a shallow type of thing, but I think that when you sit down, because I have seen it, when you sit down and think about it, you really find ways of helping them. And there is nothing that prevents you to find different strategies for different students if you understand what is the faulty reasoning, the misconceptions that they have, the things that are impeding the progress of their learning. And it is not about testing. You know, it is amazing that everybody's thinking, oh, I cannot test now anymore. Well, actually you can. You know, if you're using Zoom, you can have questions on the poll side and ask students to respond. And if you design a very good multiple choice question, which I didn't have the opportunity to show you, then you potentially can learn what are the students' errors that are leading to selecting one option and not the other. But I leave also something for Sara to say about this, because I know she has.
Yeah, I agree with everything you said, Aida. Obviously, think that this is an opportunity for us to stop and think about what matters. I think that's the most important thing. I think that teachers are realizing that, notwithstanding the comments about ordered multiple choice items can be really effective, I think teachers in this moment are realizing that if you give a multiple choice test to your students now, it's so easy for them to, let's call them crowdsourcing answers, other people might call it cheating, that you actually don't learn too much about what an individual student understands. And I think that it's a great opportunity to think about, how do I ask fewer, more open-ended questions of students to really elicit rich understanding. And I think that, you know, everything has been made plain, and I think that the world understands better how difficult it is to teach kids. I mean, I don't know how it's harder for me to teach like a first grader and a sixth grader at home than it is to teach a class of 42 kids in a high school chemistry class. Like, this is harder. And so I think that folks are really starting to realize in the larger community, the important work that teachers do and how much schools matter and how much opportunity we have to make a difference in kids' lives. And so I think if we can hold that and remember like the important role that teachers play in our society without putting the burden of like fixing every problem in society on teachers, because that's a side issue. I just want to encourage you to remember how important it is that you're there for your students and that you care about how they understand and you care about how they're learning. And when you show them that, it helps them want to grow their minds.